My name is Lila Rivera, and I never thought a weekend at home could change my life forever. I always believed my family was safe, that my home was a place where love meant protection. But one Saturday morning, that illusion shattered in the most brutal way possible. I never imagined that the man my mom called trying could leave me with a cracked skull, or that the person I trusted to care for me could be capable of such violence. And yet, as I lay in the hospital bed, the neurologist shook her head at my mom and quietly made a call to child services, a moment that would alter everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up, I always had an uneasy feeling about my stepdad, Marco. On the surface, he was charming when people were around. He could joke, make my mom laugh, and sometimes even seem genuinely caring, but there were cracks, tiny at first, that I didn't know how to name. He had a temper that could flare over nothing. He'd slam doors, yell over the smallest inconveniences, and sometimes those outbursts were directed at me. At first, I told myself it wasn't that bad, that maybe he was just stressed, or that maybe I was overreacting. My mom, Maria, seemed to see it the same way, brushing off the small bruises and the times I'd retreat to my room in tears as growing pains or discipline that would make me stronger. She would sigh and say, "He's trying, Lila. He really is trying." That phrase haunted me for years. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that my mom was right, that Marco's love could somehow exist even if his hands sometimes didn't know the difference between discipline and danger. The Saturday that changed everything started like most mornings. The sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, and I could hear Marco humming in the kitchen, a sound that usually made my stomach tighten. My little brother Danny was still asleep, curled up in his bed, oblivious to the tension that seemed to seep into every corner of our home. I had a stack of homework to finish, but I thought maybe I could sneak in a few quiet moments on my tablet before the chaos of the day arrived. Mom was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my presence, and Marco was in one of those moods I had learned to watch like a ticking clock. The argument started over something trivial, as it always did. I had left a glass on the counter overnight. He said it was disrespectful, that leaving things lying around meant I didn't care about the house or the family. I tried to apologize, tried to explain I hadn't meant anything by it, but his face twisted in anger. Words became louder, and before I could even comprehend what was happening, he grabbed my arm roughly, pulling me toward the wall. I stumbled and hit my head hard against the edge of the kitchen counter. The pain exploded immediately, sharp and unforgiving, and I felt my vision blur. My ears rang, and I tasted copper in my mouth. I tried to speak, to cry out, but my words stuck. Marco's anger didn't falter. He seemed almost unaware of the injury he had caused, focused solely on his own frustration, his own sense of power over me. When Mom finally intervened, it wasn't like in the movies, where she would scream, demand him to stop, or protect me. She simply stepped in and said, in that calm, almost weary voice, "He's trying, Lila. Just let him try." Those words, meant perhaps to comfort or explain, cut deeper than any slap or shove could have. I felt a combination of betrayal and fear. How could the person who was supposed to protect me validate someone hurting me? I didn't understand it then, but later I would realize that Mom's fear of confrontation, her own dependence on Marco, had trapped her in silence. I remember stumbling to my room, holding my head, trying to make sense of the blood trickling down the side of my face. My thoughts raced faster than my pulse, and I felt a strange combination of panic and disbelief. I wanted to scream, to run, to call someone, but my voice seemed too small, too weak. By the time Mom finally decided we needed medical attention, Hours had passed, and the pounding in my skull was relentless. At the hospital, the neurologist immediately took notice, her professional instincts sharp and unwavering. She examined me, her eyes narrowing at the swelling and the pattern of bruising. She didn't ask if I had fallen. She didn't suggest it was an accident. She saw the truth and knew it didn't belong to any ordinary household accident. When the doctor stepped out of the room for a private conversation with my mom, I remember feeling a mixture of fear and relief. Fear because I didn't know what would happen next. Relief because I sensed someone finally recognize the reality of what had occurred. I overheard her say, "This is not safe. I have to call child services." My mom didn't argue, didn't protest. Instead, she nodded quietly, almost as if admitting she had failed to protect me, to herself and to me. That moment, though frightening, planted a seed of hope, an understanding that perhaps the nightmare didn't have to continue. Even in those first few hours, as I lay in the sterile hospital bed, I felt a strange clarity. The pain in my skull was intense, but the realization of truth, that someone outside our home could see the reality, began to shift something inside me. I wasn't alone. Someone believed me. And for the first time, the phrase, "he's trying," didn't feel like a cage of fear. It felt like a distorted shield, one I could finally see through. I knew then that this story, my story, wasn't over. And I also knew that the fight for safety, for justice, and for the acknowledgement of the truth had only just begun. The first few days after the hospital visit were a blur of fear, confusion, and whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I stayed home from school not because I wanted to, but because my head throbbed relentlessly, and every bright light or sudden sound felt like a hammer against my skull. Mom tried to be present, but her expressions were always guarded, and I could tell she was balancing something I couldn't quite name. She still spoke the same words that had become almost poisonous to me. "He's trying." But now, after seeing the neurologist expression, I could tell she was torn between believing that phrase and the undeniable reality that I had been seriously hurt. The tension in the house was thick, and even Donnie seemed to sense the shift. He was quieter than usual, sticking close to Mom, and I realized that fear, like some invisible virus, was spreading silently through all of us. During that week, I began to notice the patterns I had always dismissed. Small moments that had once felt normal suddenly became glaring red flags. Marco's discipline wasn't discipline at all. It was a ritual of intimidation that often left me bruised, terrified, and doubting myself. He had a way of manipulating every word, every glance, to make it seem like it was my fault. If I flinched or cried, it was because I was too sensitive. If I tried to explain what happened, it was because I was lying to make him look bad. Mom, trapped between love and fear, continued to defend him, excusing the abuse as part of his efforts to be a better parent and teach responsibility. The realization that this pattern had been happening for years hit me like a wave I could no longer hold back. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that what had seemed like ordinary tension in our home was actually a toxic cycle, one that had been quietly eroding my sense of safety and self-worth. I tried to talk to friends, but words felt inadequate, like they would never capture the intensity of what I had experienced. Most of them just said, "Why don't you just tell your mom?" I wanted to, but I also knew that wasn't enough. Mom's words, those insidious assurances that he's trying, were stronger than any plea I could make. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she was caught in the same fear I was trying to escape. And as much as I loved her, I began to feel a creeping sense of isolation. I was living in a house full of people, yet utterly alone. In those days, the neurologist's involvement became a silent lifeline. She arranged follow-up appointments, and with every visit, I noticed her eyes scanning for more than just physical injury. She asked careful questions, making sure to separate my words from my mom's filtered interpretations. It was through these appointments that I first heard the term
Child Protection Investigation. The words felt abstract at first, but they carried weight, promise, and a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I could imagine someone stepping in, someone who didn't have to pretend that abuse could ever be excused as effort or love. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Home, however, was still a minefield. Marco's behavior didn't change overnight. His temper flared over spilled cereal, a misplaced book, or even the way I looked at him. The bruises on my arms and the swelling on my head were only physical markers of a deeper, more insidious reality. Control. He controlled our words, our movements, and even our emotions. Every day became a careful negotiation, a balance of avoiding triggers and hiding my fear in ways I hadn't yet learned to articulate. Danny, too young to fully understand, would cling to me during these episodes, his small arms wrapping around my leg as if he could somehow shield me from the chaos. Watching him, I realized that my own experience wasn't just mine. It had the power to affect those I loved most. The responsibility weighed on me, heavier than any textbook or chore ever could. Despite the danger, I began to notice a change inside myself. Something had shifted during those hospital hours, something that whispered, I didn't have to accept this as normal. I started keeping a journal, writing every incident in detail, the date, the time, the exact words spoken, the injuries, and even the emotions I felt in the aftermath. Writing became a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim control over my narrative. I labeled moments clearly: abuse, intimidation, fear, because naming them made them real. And the more real they became, the less power Marco had to distort the truth. Each entry became a piece of evidence I could use when the moment came to confront the reality we had all been hiding.
Mom's role during this time was complicated. She oscillated between protection and denial, love and fear, support and defense of Marco. I saw her cry quietly at night, likely battling her own guilt and confusion. I wanted to reach her, to explain that my goal wasn't to hurt her marriage or disrupt our home. It was to survive, to be safe, and to hold someone accountable for what had happened to me. But every conversation ended with her repeating that fateful phrase, "He's trying," and I realized that her inability to act decisively was part of the very problem. It was not a lack of love. It was the weight of fear, dependence, and perhaps years of convincing herself that things would improve if she just held on long enough. Even with Mom's hesitations, the neurologist continued to be an ally, quietly guiding me through steps I didn't fully understand. I learned about documenting injuries, recording conversations, and noticing behavioral patterns that could be corroborated by professionals. I began to understand that the truth wasn't something I had to fight for alone. There were structures, systems, and people whose job it was to protect children like me. This knowledge, though small and slow-growing, became a seed of hope that began to sprout in the dark soil of fear I had been living in for years. By the end of that week, I had made a promise to myself. I would survive, I would endure, and I would not allow fear or loyalty to silence the truth. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my brother. It was about anyone trapped in a home where abuse was masked as effort, where control was disguised as love. The house remained tense, Marco still unpredictable, and Mom still caught in the web of denial. But inside me, a resolve was hardening. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that enduring in silence wasn't safety. It was a slow surrender, and surrender was no longer an option. It was just another ordinary Thursday when the moment came that I could no longer ignore, the moment that shattered any remaining illusions I had about what trying meant in our house. The morning started quietly, with the sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and birds chirping outside the window. I had hoped for a peaceful day, a reprieve from the constant tension that had been building for weeks, maybe even months. But peace, I quickly realized, was never part of Marco's vocabulary.
He had woken up earlier than usual, pacing through the living room, muttering about chores that hadn't been completed, about breakfast that was too slow, about the dishes that weren't spotless enough. At first, it seemed like his usual irritability, but as I walked into the kitchen with Danny trailing behind me, I noticed the subtle shift, the tightening of his jaw, the sharpness in his eyes, the way his hands twitched near the edge of the counter. I tried to keep my voice calm, soft, careful. "I'll do the dishes, Marco," I said, hoping my words would placate him and prevent an argument. But instead of easing, his anger escalated in an instant, turning the room into a furnace of aggression. His words became sharper, faster, and soon he was shouting in a way that made my ears ring. The air felt thick, almost solid, as if the tension itself could knock me over. I froze when he reached for the dish in my hands, his grip tightening unnaturally, jerking the plate out of my fingers and sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening in the quiet morning, the shards of ceramic scattering across the tiles like fragments of the peace I had once known. I flinched, my heart pounding, and that's when it happened. Marco swung his hand with a force I didn't have time to anticipate, striking my temple. The impact was immediate, sending me sprawling backward, my skull colliding violently with the edge of the counter. Pain exploded across my head, radiating down my neck and into my shoulders. Stars danced in front of my eyes, my ears rang, and my body felt both heavy and unresponsive at the same time. I tried to speak, tried to cry out for help, but the words caught in my throat. My vision blurred, the room spinning as if I were suddenly underwater. Danny's small voice screamed, his cry slicing through the haze, but Marco's anger didn't falter. He stood over me, his shadow looming large, his face twisted in a mix of frustration and impatience, as if the pain he had just caused me were an inconvenience, rather than a crime. Mom appeared then, hesitant, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and indecision. "Lila, he's trying," she said softly, almost pleading, almost as if speaking the words aloud could transform the assault into something harmless. But her words had no power here. They were hollow shields in a room filled with raw violence. The moment crystallized in my mind, the difference between what was said and what was done, the stark reality that my mother's attempts to rationalize abuse could not undo the harm that had been inflicted. By the time I stumbled to my bedroom, clutching the side of my head, I knew I needed help beyond anything my family could provide. The pain was relentless, a pulsing drumbeat in my skull that made every heartbeat feel like another collision. I tried to make sense of what had happened, the events replaying over and over in my mind. Each flashback was a reminder that the danger was not an accident, not a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a deliberate act masked as discipline. And yet, even in the haze of pain and fear, a strange clarity emerged. I understood that the cycle I had been living in for years had escalated to a point where it could no longer be contained, denied, or excused. This was no longer a household argument or a clash of personalities. It was abuse, plain and simple, and I had to act before it spiraled even further. Mom's attempts to soothe me were tentative, cautious. She wrapped me in a blanket, dabbed at the fresh swelling forming on my temple, and muttered apologies that didn't reach their intended impact. I didn't know it would. "He's trying," she said again, her voice faltering. I felt a bitter mix of sorrow and anger. Her love was genuine, I knew that, but it was entangled with fear, complicity, and a stubborn adherence to a lie that was slowly destroying me. I realized in that painful moment that my survival depended on someone outside the house recognizing the truth, a truth that my mother, for all her good intentions, could not fully confront herself. Later that afternoon, when the neurologist called for a follow-up, I knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. She examined me carefully, noting the swelling, the bruising, and the way my eyes reacted to light. Her expression was unreadable at first, then slowly a combination of concern and resolve settled across her face. She didn't speak in euphemisms or attempt to soften the reality. She documented everything meticulously, asking pointed questions about who was responsible, how it had happened, and whether this was part of a recurring pattern. Each answer I gave was a step toward unmasking the hidden truth, each detail a brick in a foundation I could finally use to defend myself. It was then that she made the call I had been both dreading and hoping for, to Child Services. She explained the situation, provided her medical observations, and recommended immediate intervention. Mom listened quietly, her hands wringing in her lap, and I could see her inner struggle, the clash between maternal instinct, fear of disrupting the family unit, and recognition that my safety had to come first. The reality was stark. For the first time, someone outside my family was stepping in to protect me, someone who could see the abuse for exactly what it was, without rationalization or excuse. That night, as I lay in my bed, the throbbing in my skull beginning to ease just slightly, I felt a cautious spark of hope. I knew the days ahead would be complicated, filled with investigations, interviews, and difficult confrontations, but I also understood that the breaking point had been reached. The hidden truth could no longer be ignored, hidden, or dismissed. Someone had seen it, acknowledged it, and acted. And in that acknowledgement, I found the first real glimmer of power in a situation that had long made me feel helpless. The path ahead was uncertain, but at least I was no longer alone. And at least the truth was beginning to emerge from the shadows where it had been trapped for too long. The following week felt like walking through a fog, each day a strange mixture of fear, uncertainty, and anticipation. I could feel the invisible line in the sand that had been crossed, the point of no return, and it was terrifying and liberating all at once. The first official visit from Child Services arrived unexpectedly one morning, knocking firmly, but politely, at our front door. I remember holding my little brother close, Danny's small hand clasped tightly in mine, as we waited in the living room. Marco was quiet, unusually calm, but I could sense the tension radiating from him. He always had a way of assessing the situation, measuring potential threats, and I knew that this was different. There would be no easy manipulation this time. Outside eyes were watching. When the caseworker introduced herself, her presence filled the room with a formality and authority I had never experienced at home. She spoke with Mom first, then directed her attention towards me. I could feel her gaze, careful and professional, probing for the truth, and for the first time, I realized I didn't have to hide. I could speak freely without the fear of my words being twisted into blame or guilt. Mom's reaction was complicated. She seemed torn between defensiveness and fear, between her desire to shield Marco and her realization that our safety had to come first. She followed the caseworker into the kitchen, answer questions, leaving me alone in the living room with Danny, and I felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because I wasn't being directly confronted or silenced. Anxiety because I didn't know what Mom might say behind closed doors and whether her words might inadvertently protect the very person who had hurt me. I had grown accustomed to keeping secrets, to crafting my own narratives to survive the household storms, but now I was discovering that the weight of truth could finally be lifted, if only partially.
Over the next hours, the house transformed into a space I didn't fully recognize. Boxes were moved, cabinets were opened, small signs of careful observation that I had never noticed before. The caseworker asked detailed questions about every incident, every bruise, every moment of fear I could recall. At first, my voice trembled, hesitant and quiet, but as I recounted the experiences I had been too afraid to name before, I felt a strange sense of power. Each word was a step toward reclaiming control, each story a brick in the foundation of my defense. I spoke of the morning Marco had struck me with the plate, of the bruises that had gone unnoticed, and of the countless times I had been silenced by Mom's insistence that he was trying. I realized as I spoke that these events were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a carefully maintained illusion that had masked repeated violence and control. Marco, for his part, was a steady and calculated calm. He answered questions with precision, denying as he could, twisting the narrative subtly, relying on Mom's earlier hesitations as leverage.
But the caseworker was thorough, asking follow-up questions that I had never heard asked before, probing inconsistencies, and observing behavior. I could see the cracks forming in the mask Marco had worn so convincingly for years. Every denial, every defensive gesture was met with quiet scrutiny. And for the first time, I felt that the truth might actually hold weight outside the walls of our home. It was a strange mixture of fear and validation, the fear of what might happen next, and the validation that my experiences were real and mattered. During the course of the investigation, I noticed Mom shifting in small but meaningful ways. She began to acknowledge what had been happening, hesitantly at first, admitting moments where she had seen too late or misinterpreted what she had witnessed. There were tears, whispered apologies, and moments of quiet acknowledgement that this had been her failing as much as it was Marco's aggression. It was complicated to watch, this mixture of maternal love and guilt, but it was important. I realized that for the first time, Mom was seeing the situation not through the lens of denial, but through the lens of truth. And that recognition, however late, was critical. The point of no return came most vividly in the conversation the caseworker had with me privately. She sat across from me, clipboard in hand, and said words I had both dreaded and hoped for. "Lila, what you've told us, combined with the medical reports, means we have to act. This is serious. Your safety cannot be compromised any longer." Hearing those words out loud from someone whose authority and intention I could trust made my heart race. I understood that things would never be the same. Marco could no longer dictate the narrative or hide behind the phrase, "he's trying." The investigation had given me legitimacy, evidence, and an external witness who would ensure that the truth could not be buried. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the house had shifted dramatically. The tension was thicker, more palpable, because now Marco understood that he was under scrutiny. He could no longer manipulate or intimidate as easily. The outside eyes had changed the power dynamic irrevocably. Mom, too, seemed different, more subdued, quieter, yet in some ways more present. She no longer tried to rationalize his behavior in the same way, and though she was still conflicted, there was a sense that the first steps toward acknowledging reality had been taken. Danny clung to me that night, sensing the shift as well. I held him close, whispering promises that we would be okay, that this was the beginning of change. That evening, lying in bed with my head still throbbing from the earlier abuse, I felt a mixture of fear, relief, and cautious optimism. The point of no return had been crossed. The truth was now being examined by impartial eyes, and the structures in place to protect children like me had begun to move. I knew the road ahead would be challenging, with more confrontations, more revelations, and perhaps more fear. But I also knew, with a certainty I had never felt before, that I was no longer alone in this fight. The truth had begun to emerge, and for the first time, I could imagine a future where safety and justice were possible. It was a turning point, a moment that marked the end of denial and the beginning of accountability. And though the journey ahead would be fraught, I felt a spark of hope that I had not dared to feel in years. After the caseworker's visit, the atmosphere in our house shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. On the surface, life seemed the same. School still demanded my attention, Danny still clung to my side, and Mom went about her daily routines. But beneath the surface, everything had shifted. Marco no longer had the freedom to act without scrutiny, yet his presence was heavier than ever. His eyes followed me with a calculated intensity, his words clipped and measured, as if he were trying to gauge the boundaries of what he could say or do without triggering further investigation. Every step I took, every sound I made, felt like it was being weighed and measured, analyzed for missteps. And in the midst of this tension, I realized that my own role had changed. I could no longer remain silent or passive. I had to actively gather the truth, document it, and prepare for the confrontation that was inevitable. I started by revisiting the journal I had begun weeks earlier, detailing every incident, every bruise, every moment of fear I could remember.
What had started as a personal coping mechanism now became a structured record, a map of the abuse that I could show to professionals if necessary. I added dates, times, and descriptions of physical injuries, but also captured the emotional and psychological toll, how Marco's words eroded my confidence, how Danny's frightened eyes reflected my own despair, and how Mom's attempts at rationalization often left me feeling more isolated than protected. I realized that in order to make the truth undeniable, I needed concrete evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Each entry in that journal was a piece of the puzzle, a testament to the reality of our home life, and a tool that could eventually protect us. At school, I began to notice patterns in myself that I hadn't acknowledged before. I flinched at sudden movements, avoided certain topics in conversation, and carried a constant tension in my shoulders. My teachers noticed my withdrawn behavior, but I was careful not to let anyone see the full extent of what had been happening. It was difficult to balance the need to protect myself with the desire to seek help from the outside world. I confided in a school counselor, a compassionate woman named Miss Carver, who listened intently as I recounted what I could. Her calm demeanor and unwavering attention made me feel, for the first time in years, that someone actually believed me. She didn't interrupt, didn't question my motives, and didn't make excuses for the situation. Instead, she encouraged me to continue documenting incidents, advised me on how to communicate safely, and reassured me that my experiences were valid. Miss Carver's support became another lifeline, reinforcing the understanding that gathering evidence and seeking help was not betrayal, it was survival. Meanwhile, back at home, Marco's behavior became more unpredictable. He seemed aware of the scrutiny from both the caseworker and the neurologist, but that awareness did not quell his anger. If anything, it intensified it. Small incidents became flashpoints. A dish left on the counter too long, a misplaced sock, or a question asked too slowly. Each minor provocation set off a chain reaction, escalating into yelling, threats, and physical intimidation. Mom tried to intervene, but her hesitations and conflicting loyalties often undermined her effectiveness. I realized that while outside oversight provided some protection, it could not erase the reality of living under the same roof with someone whose temper had become a constant threat. I had to remain vigilant, careful in my movements, and conscious of every interaction. The fear was exhausting, but it also honed a clarity I hadn't possessed before. I had to be precise, observant, and ready to present the truth when the time came. As the days passed, I also began to notice the reactions of others, neighbors, family friends, and even distant relatives, who had always seen Marco as a charming, affable man. The contrast between his public persona and his private behavior became increasingly clear to me. I realized that the danger of his manipulation extended beyond our home. It relied on controlling the narrative and maintaining appearances. To counter this, I needed more than personal recollections. I needed corroboration, evidence that could pierce the veneer of respectability and reveal the hidden truth. I began to notice small signs: Danny's quiet withdrawal, the bruises he had developed from playful interactions, and the way Mom sometimes flinched when Marco raised his voice. Each observation, while subtle, became part of a growing body of evidence that could no longer be dismissed as accident or overreaction. The pressure intensified when the caseworker returned for a follow-up visit. Marco's demeanor was tense, his charm replaced by a cautious wariness that betrayed his awareness of scrutiny. I spoke honestly and openly, detailing the recent incidents and explaining the emotional toll of living in constant fear. I shared my journal, my observations, and my carefully documented timeline of events. The caseworker listened intently, asked pointed questions, and reassured me that my efforts to document the truth were exactly what would allow for protection and accountability. That meeting, while exhausting, marked a turning point in the investigation.
The hidden patterns of abuse were no longer invisible. They were being recognized, analyzed, and validated. By the end of the week, I understood the growing opposition that had formed around me. Marco was actively trying to maintain control, testing boundaries and asserting dominance where he could. Mom, while beginning to acknowledge the truth, was still caught between loyalty and fear, creating additional tension that I had to navigate carefully. Yet, despite these challenges, I felt a sense of empowerment that had been absent in years. The act of gathering evidence, documenting events, and sharing my experiences with trusted adults had transformed fear into action. I realized that the truth was no longer something that could be ignored or silenced. It was becoming undeniable. And in that growing awareness, I found the courage to prepare for the moments ahead, knowing that confrontation and revelation were on the horizon, and that the hidden story of our home could finally be exposed.
The day the major revelation came was unlike any day I had experienced before. It started quietly, with the routine hum of our home that had become so familiar. Yet beneath it, a tension simmered like a kettle on the edge of boiling over. I had been keeping my journal meticulously, noting every incident, every bruise, every whispered threat or moment of intimidation. And yet, until that morning, I hadn't fully understood the magnitude of what my documentation could reveal. The neurologist had scheduled another follow-up, and I remember feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and dread as we entered her office. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew that whatever was coming would change everything. Mom sat beside me, silent. Her fingers twined nervously, and I could sense her own apprehension. She had begun to see the truth in pieces, but today would make it undeniable. The neurologist, Dr. Simmons, greeted us with her usual calm professionalism, but there was a weight in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She began by reviewing the medical reports from my previous visits, noting the swelling, the contusions, and the pattern of injuries. But this time, she went further. She asked detailed questions, not just about my immediate injuries, but about past incidents, minor accidents that had left bruises, unexplained falls, and moments when I had been unusually withdrawn or fearful. Each answer I gave was carefully recorded, and I could see her connecting the dots in real time, building a clear picture that I had only glimpsed in fragments before. I realized then that what had seemed like isolated incidents over the years were actually part of a systematic pattern of abuse, and it was Dr. Simmons who was finally making it concrete. The revelation hit hardest when she asked to see my journal. I handed it over, a little afraid, unsure if the words I had written in private would convince an adult that my experiences were real. She began to read silently, her eyes scanning each page, absorbing the timeline, the descriptions, the small observations I had noted about Mom's reactions and Marco's behaviors. I watched her face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. Instead, I saw a shift, a confirmation that the truth I had been holding inside for so long was finally being recognized by someone who had the authority and the expertise to act. She looked up and said, gently but firmly, "Lila, this is undeniable. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to ensure your safety." Her words, so simple, yet so powerful, hit me like a wave. For the first time in years, I felt seen, heard, and believed in a way that transcended fear and uncertainty. Dr. Simmons didn't stop there. She explained in detail what the next steps would be. The medical documentation would be shared with Child Services, who could then move forward with protective measures, and an official investigation would begin. She outlined the process, the potential outcomes, and the support structures available for both me and Danny. The clarity of her explanation, the structured approach to ensuring our safety, made the invisible become tangible.
For years, I had lived in a fog of fear and uncertainty, and now the path forward was illuminated, a roadmap toward protection, accountability, and eventual justice. What made the moment even striking was the way Mom reacted. At first, she seemed hesitant, almost as if the recognition of the truth was too heavy to bear. Tears welled in her eyes, and she murmured apologies that had a weight of both guilt and relief. For years, she had clung to the phrase, "he's trying," as a shield against the reality of our situation, and now that shield had fallen away. Mom's quiet acknowledgement of her own complicity, her recognition that she had, despite her love, failed to protect us, was both painful and validating. I understood in that instant that our lives had reached a tipping point. The hidden abuse could no longer be excused or minimized, and action would follow. As Dr. Simmons prepared to make her report to Child Services, I felt an unusual surge of courage. For so long, I had felt powerless, trapped within the walls of our home, forced to navigate the tension and unpredictability of Marco's temper. But this moment, this undeniable evidence and professional acknowledgement transformed my fear into determination. I realized that the truth was not just a collection of bruises, words, and memories. It was a weapon, a shield, and a bridge to safety. And in understanding that, I began to feel a sense of agency I had never known before. I was no longer just a victim. I was a witness, a recorder, a participant in my own rescue. By the time we left Dr. Simmons' office, the weight of the revelation settled heavily over us. The reality of what had been hidden for years was now undeniable, concrete, and actionable. Mom and I returned home, the house feeling both familiar and foreign, the tension still present, but tinged now with anticipation of change. Marco was there, his presence looming, but I could sense the subtle shift in the power dynamic. The outside eyes of professionals, combined with the documented evidence of my experiences, had begun to fracture the control he had long maintained. For the first time, I felt the possibility that the abuse could be interrupted, that the hidden truth could finally surface in a way that demanded accountability.
That night, as I lay in bed with Danny curled beside me, I felt a mixture of fear, relief, and cautious hope. The journey was far from over. The investigation would continue, Marco's resistance would escalate, and Mom would still struggle with her own conflicted feelings. But the undeniable proof that had emerged in Dr. Simmons' office had shifted the trajectory of our lives. The hidden truth was no longer buried, and I had finally begun to understand the power of documentation, witness, and professional advocacy. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where we could be safe, where accountability could replace denial, and where the courage to speak and document the truth could protect us from the darkness that had haunted our home for so long. After the neurologist's confirmation and the mounting evidence compiled for Child Services, I faced a moment that both terrified me and empowered me. The choice to speak, to finally stop protecting Marco, to fully reveal the truth, even if it meant shaking the foundations of my family. I remember sitting in my room that evening, Danny asleep beside me, the journal open on my lap, and feeling the full weight of what was coming. For years, I had carried the responsibility of silence, of masking bruises, of convincing myself that enduring Marco's temper was somehow normal or temporary. But now, with undeniable evidence, professional acknowledgement, and the faint but growing support of my mother, I knew that silence was no longer an option. Speaking up would mark a point of no return. Once I did, nothing could go back to the way it was. It was frightening, but it was necessary. I had to step forward not only for my own safety, but for Danny's and for the truth that had been suppressed for far too long. The choice to speak came in small, tentative steps before it became a full declaration. I began by confronting my own fears, mentally rehearsing what I would say to the caseworker, the authorities, and even to Mom, who remained conflicted and unsure of her own role. I thought about the nights I had spent crying silently,
The times I had flinched at Marco's shadow. The days I had watched Danny cower and shrink under the same pressure. Each memory, each piece of pain became fuel for the courage I knew I had to summon. I realized that by speaking the truth, I wasn't betraying anyone. I was protecting life, safety, and justice. The moment I fully embraced that idea, the fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into a determined clarity. Mom's response during this period was critical. She was no longer actively excusing Marco's actions, but the hesitation lingered. She admitted in fragmented, tearful sentences that she had tried to rationalize the abuse as a way to preserve the family and give Marco the benefit of the doubt. She confessed that she had been scared of what might happen if she challenged him directly, and of what it would mean for her own life if she took a stand. Hearing her acknowledge this, without judgment, her recognition that her inaction was part of the problem, helped me understand that our family dynamic was built on fear, not love, and that truth would have to be the foundation of the next steps. I could see that Mom's eyes were opening to the reality of our lives, and though her guilt was palpable, I knew it was essential to separate her fear from the path forward. When the caseworker returned for another formal visit, I knew it was time. I spoke openly, deliberately, recounting every incident, describing every bruise, and explaining the fear and isolation that Marco's presence had caused. I presented the journal, the observations, and even the behavioral shifts I had noted in Danny and Mom. The caseworker listened, nodding, taking meticulous notes, and occasionally asking clarifying questions. For the first time, I felt that my voice truly mattered, that the words I had kept bottled up for years were finally being heard in a way that demanded action. Marco sat silently across from me, his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack as the evidence accumulated. His calm, once a tool of intimidation, now seemed fragile, brittle, and ineffective in the face of documented truth. The act of speaking also forced a confrontation within our home. Marco could no longer manipulate the narrative or cast doubt on Mom's recollections, and Mom herself could no longer feign ignorance. The truth was being laid bare, and everyone had to reckon with it. Marco's attempts at intimidation became sharper, but the authority of the caseworker and the weight of my documentation limited the scope of his control. I noticed subtle signs of his growing frustration, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes darted, the small, sharp gestures that betrayed the anger he could no longer fully express without consequence. It was both frightening and satisfying to witness the moment when his dominance began to waver, and I felt a cautious sense of empowerment. Danny, too, began to respond to the shift. He was still frightened, still clinging to me when Marco entered the room, but I could see the tiniest sparks of relief in his expression. He sensed, even in his young way, that the tides were changing, that protection and advocacy were no longer abstract ideas but tangible forces shaping our lives. I began to guide him through the understanding that the truth mattered, that it could keep us safe, and that we no longer had to endure fear in silence. Speaking up became a shared act, a way to reclaim some control over the chaos that had defined our household for far too long.
By the end of that day, I understood that the choice to speak had irrevocably altered our lives. It was no longer possible to return to pretense, to rationalize or excuse. The hidden truth had emerged, undeniable, and our family dynamic was being reshaped in real time. There were no guarantees, and fear remained a constant companion, but the act of speaking, of presenting evidence, of demanding recognition and protection had created a turning point. The truth was now visible, undeniable, and actionable, and for the first time in years, I felt the fragile beginnings of hope. This was the moment when silence ended, when courage overcame fear, and when the first real steps toward safety, justice, and accountability began to take shape. The confrontation that had been building for months finally arrived, and it was unlike anything I had anticipated. Marco sensed the shift in power immediately, the moment when his control began to slip and the outside world took notice of his behavior. He no longer had the ability to intimidate through silence or fear alone. Every movement, every word was now measured, scrutinized, and challenged. That morning, the tension in the house was nearly tangible, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact.
Marco moved through the rooms with a predatory intensity, his glare cutting across the living room, his voice clipped but edged with venom. I could feel his focus on me, a silent warning that the escalating scrutiny was unwelcome, that he would resist with every ounce of control he had left. But I had already stepped beyond fear. I had documented, spoken, and enlisted support. And the realization gave me a strange mixture of calm and determination. Mom, surprisingly, had begun to assert herself in subtle ways. She no longer parroted the phrase, "he's trying," with the blind reassurance that had once masked the reality of abuse. Instead, she stood a little taller, asked questions with a newfound firmness, and even defended my accounts to Marco when he tried to dismiss or distort the facts. Her shift was not complete. The remnants of fear and conflicted loyalty lingered, but the change was unmistakable. I could see the small victories accumulating. Marco's gaslighting attempts were met with hesitation rather than compliance, and Mom's voice, once hesitant and apologetic, now carried a tone of cautious authority. Even Danny, sensing the mounting pressure, seemed more confident in expressing his own discomfort, leaning on me for support, but showing small flashes of bravery. The dynamics in the household were evolving, the tension no longer unilateral, and the confrontation that had seemed inevitable was beginning to take form. The external involvement added weight to every interaction. The caseworker's regular check-ins, combined with Dr. Simmons' medical documentation, created a framework of accountability that Marco could not easily dismiss. I noticed his frustration intensify as he realized that the walls he had built around control were no longer impermeable. His anger became sharper, his attempts at intimidation more desperate, but simultaneously, his power was visibly eroding. I saw him in private moments pacing, muttering to himself, trying to rationalize the mounting scrutiny, and even attempting to manipulate Mom by appealing to her fear of family disruption. These tactics, which had once succeeded effortlessly, now faltered against the combined weight of external observation, documentation, and the courage I had begun to display. One afternoon, the confrontation escalated to a breaking point. Marco demanded to know why I had been telling lies about him, his voice louder, more menacing than usual. He grabbed a stack of papers I had been using to organize my journal entries, shoving them toward me as if their presence alone were an accusation. The gesture, intended to intimidate, backfired spectacularly. I calmly retrieved the papers, organized them carefully, and met his gaze without flinching. Mom, witnessing this for the first time, intervened with a firmness that surprised even her, saying that the documents were factual records and that the caseworker was already aware of every incident. Marco's mask faltered. The carefully maintained facade of calm authority slipped, replaced with visible frustration and thinly veiled rage. For the first time, his dominance was not assumed, but actively contested. And the house itself seemed to resonate with the tension of the standoff. Danny, ever sensitive to the environment, began to mirror the shift in dynamics. Where he had previously retreated into silence, he now voiced objections to Marco's small provocations, guided by the knowledge that the truth had allies and that he was no longer entirely defenseless. I encouraged him, quietly explaining that our documentation and the caseworker's involvement meant that we were being taken seriously, that our voices mattered, and that Marco could no longer hurt us without consequences. The courage in his small gestures, the way he finally refused to follow a verbal command that would place him in harm's way, the way he avoided escalating situations, reinforced my own resolve. The confrontation was no longer abstract, it was lived, tangible, and inevitable. By evening, the mounting pressure had forced Marco to retreat temporarily into silence, though the tension in the room remained palpable. Mom and I took stock quietly, acknowledging the small victories and the larger battles yet to come. The confrontation had not ended in dramatic resolution, but it had shifted the power dynamic irreversibly. Marco's control had been challenged, his deceit and aggression exposed to eyes beyond our home, and our voices had begun to assert their validity. The mounting pressure, both external and internal, had created a situation where truth and accountability were no longer negotiable. It was exhausting, terrifying, and invigorating all at once, a crucible of fear and courage that marked a turning point in the trajectory of our lives.
That night, lying in bed with Danny, I realized the confrontation was only the beginning of a longer process.
one that would test patience, resilience, and courage. Yet, for the first time, I could see that the truth had teeth. It could challenge lies, disrupt patterns of abuse, and protect those who had been silenced. The mounting pressure of confrontation had done more than expose Marco's behavior. It had awakened something in us, a recognition that standing against abuse, even in its most intimate forms, was not only possible, but necessary. And as I drifted into a restless sleep, I held on to the sense that our lives were finally moving toward justice, validation, and safety, one confrontation at a time. The days following the confrontation brought a crushing weight that I hadn't anticipated, a sense of dread and despair that seeped into every corner of our lives. Even though the truth had been acknowledged by professionals and the caseworker was now actively involved, the immediate backlash hit hard, and the emotional toll was almost unbearable. Marco's anger, previously restrained by the presence of witnesses, now found subtle ways to manifest, and his resentment toward Mom and me grew more toxic and unpredictable. He no longer raised his hand openly, at least not in front of outsiders, but the tension he created through words, threats, and manipulations was suffocating. It was the kind of pressure that gnawed at your confidence, left your chest tight with anxiety, and made every decision feel like a potential trigger. Mom, still struggling with the guilt of her past inaction, vacillated between protective instincts and a lingering fear of confrontation, leaving me to navigate the emotional landscape with caution and vigilance. I began to feel the real consequences of speaking the truth. At school, I was distracted, unable to focus, replaying interactions from home and imagining the worst possible scenarios. Danny's mood swings mirrored my own stress, and I found myself torn between attending to my own emotional needs and safeguarding his fragile sense of security. The caseworker remained a stabilizing force, but even her guidance could not shield us from the internal chaos that followed disclosure. For the first time, I truly understood that seeking justice and safety didn't erase fear. It amplified it initially, because the enemy was now aware that their secrets were exposed and retaliation was a tangible threat. Every creak of the floorboards, every sudden shout from Marco felt magnified, and my ability to feel safe within the home I once thought I knew vanished. The emotional isolation became particularly acute during the nights. Lying in bed, I replayed every moment, every interaction, every word spoken during the investigation and confrontation. I questioned whether I had done the right thing, whether revealing the truth had truly made us safer, or if it had only escalated Marco's anger in ways we couldn't yet predict. Sleep became elusive. Nightmares of being trapped, of hearing Marco's voice grow louder and more threatening, haunted me relentlessly. Danny would stir beside me, whispering concerns or asking if everything was okay, and I would have to muster the strength to reassure him even when I wasn't sure myself. The dual burden of protecting a younger sibling while processing my own trauma created an overwhelming sense of helplessness, a realization that even with proof and professional support, the path to safety was far from simple. Mom's struggle added another layer to the darkness. She tried to mediate between Marco and us, attempting to soften his aggression while maintaining her parental authority, but her hesitation often emboldened his manipulation. Her guilt was visible in every hesitant glance, every pause before she spoke, and I could feel her internal conflict radiating throughout the house. She had begun to understand the severity of Marco's actions and the necessity of accountability, yet she still feared the upheaval that truth had initiated. Watching her wrestle with these feelings while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy left me emotionally exhausted. I realized that Mom's support, while crucial, could not alone protect us. I needed to rely on external systems, my own observations, and the resolve that had been slowly building within me. The mounting pressure manifested physically as well. I felt constant tension in my shoulders, headaches that pulsed with each argument or raised voice, and a fatigue that seemed impossible to shake. Even small interactions with Marco, once inconsequential, now set off intense anxiety as if I were walking on eggshells perpetually. My appetite disappeared, and I found myself losing weight from the combination of stress and vigilance. The weight of responsibility, keeping Danny safe, documenting every incident, coordinating with professionals, and managing Mom's conflicting emotions pressed heavily upon me. For the first time, I understood how profoundly abuse permeates life, not only in immediate pain, but in the enduring consequences on body, mind, and spirit. One particularly harrowing moment occurred when Marco confronted me late in the evening. His tone was low and deliberate, a quiet menace that carried more weight than his previous outbursts. He demanded answers about the caseworker's visits, questioned what I had told them, and implied threats that were chilling in their subtlety. I stood my ground, reciting the facts calmly, leaning on the journal and the documentation I had compiled. The confrontation ended without physical violence, but the emotional impact lingered for days, a constant reminder that while the truth had power, it did not immediately dissolve the danger. This was the dark night of the soul, the point where courage was tested, where the consequences of speaking truth were most acute, and where fear threatened to overshadow every step forward.
Despite the fear, however, a small ember of resilience remained. Each day, I reminded myself that the documented evidence, the caseworker's involvement, and the eventual legal processes were shields against unchecked harm. Danny's small signs of trust and growing courage reinforced my own strength, and even Mom's tentative acknowledgement of the truth, painful though it was for her, offered glimmers of solidarity. I understood that this low point, while crushing, was not the end. It was a necessary stage of the journey, a test of endurance that would precede the final push for justice. The darkness was real, tangible, and suffocating, but it also illuminated the stakes, the lives at risk, the courage required, and the imperative to continue despite fear. In that moment, I realized that survival was no longer about silence or submission. It was about perseverance, strategy, and unwavering commitment to truth. The day of the final push arrived with a gravity I could feel in every fiber of my body. Months of fear, documentation, confrontation, and emotional exhaustion had led to this moment, the point at which the truth would finally face the ultimate test, where evidence, courage, and advocacy would collide against the lies that had long held sway in our home. The caseworker had arranged a formal meeting with child services officials, and this time, the gathering was larger, more official, and intimidating in its presence. Mom, Danny, and I entered the office together, a fragile but united front carrying with us the culmination of every observation, every journal entry, and every documented injury. Marco, aware that the scrutiny could no longer be sidestepped, appeared visibly tense, his composure fraying at the edges. For the first time, the illusion of his dominance was shattered in a room filled with witnesses, all eyes on the truth. I remember sitting at the table, my hands gripping the edges, heart racing but steady, knowing that the weight of our future depended on my voice and my ability to convey the reality we had endured. The officials began by reviewing the compiled evidence, medical records, photographs, detailed journal entries, and notes from previous caseworker visits. Each item on the table represented a piece of a hidden puzzle, a story of pain, fear, and resilience that could no longer be ignored. As they examined the documents, I felt a mixture of dread and vindication. Dread because Marco's reaction was unpredictable, and vindication because the truth, so long silenced and minimized, was finally being acknowledged in a way that demanded accountability.
Marco attempted to interject, trying to cast doubt on the validity of the documents in my testimony. He claimed that the injuries were accidents, that the descriptions were exaggerated, and that Mom's involvement somehow mitigated his responsibility. But the professionals, guided by the objective evidence we had painstakingly compiled, countered each point with precision. The medical records from Dr. Simmons provided undeniable proof of repeated trauma consistent with abuse. Photographs corroborated injuries that Marco could not explain away. And the detailed journal entries painted a vivid picture of life in a household where fear and control dictated daily existence. The room was a crucible of truth, and for the first time, the lies that had protected him for so long were being dismantled systematically, methodically, and irrevocably. Mom's voice, hesitant but growing firmer, joined in. She spoke candidly about the moments she had rationalized Marco's behavior, her previous inaction, and the difficult emotional journey that led her to finally support our case. Her words carried weight precisely because they acknowledged the complexity of her loyalty, fear, and love, yet affirmed the necessity of protection and accountability. I watched as her confession, tempered by honesty and maternal concern, lent credibility to my own testimony. The convergence of our voices, combined with the weight of objective evidence, created a force that Marco could not counter. His presence at the table grew smaller, his attempts at intimidation muted by the authority of the professionals and the clarity of the documented truth. The culmination of the final push came when the officials began outlining immediate protective measures. They explained that Marco would be temporarily removed from the household, that a formal investigation would continue, and that both Danny and I would receive support services to address the trauma we had endured. The room, once thick with tension, began to breathe with relief as the process moved forward. Marco, visibly defeated, understood that the carefully maintained illusion of dominance had been shattered. For the first time, he confronted the reality of consequences, an external system of accountability that he could not manipulate, charm, or intimidate into compliance.
As I walked out of that room with Mom and Danny, a profound mixture of relief, exhaustion, and cautious hope washed over me. The confrontation had been exhausting, the pressure immense, but the truth had prevailed in the arena where it mattered most. I realized that the final push, the act of presenting evidence, testifying to our lived experiences, and confronting fear directly, had transformed us from victims into participants in our own rescue. The path ahead was still long. There would be healing, continued legal processes, and emotional recovery to navigate. But the climax had been reached. The truth was no longer invisible, the hidden abuse had been exposed, and the system had recognized our right to protection and safety. That evening, lying in my room with Danny asleep beside me, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. Every journal entry, every confrontation, every moment of courage had led to this point. I understood the power of documentation, the importance of speaking up, and the necessity of persistence in the face of fear. The final push had proven that truth, when combined with evidence and courage, could overcome even the most entrenched patterns of abuse. And though the path to full healing and justice was ongoing, I finally felt the tangible beginnings of safety, empowerment, and hope. The hard-won rewards of having faced fear, confrontation, and deception head-on. In the days following the formal intervention, the household began to shift in ways that felt both surreal and profoundly relieving. Marco's removal, though temporary, created a space that allowed Mom, Danny, and me to breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing down on every decision. The first morning after he left, I woke to the unusual quiet of our home, the absence of tension so palpable it almost felt foreign. I moved through the rooms cautiously, half expecting the sharp, calculating presence that had dominated our lives for so long, but it was gone. In that quiet, I realized how much space had been occupied by fear, how much energy had been spent navigating his moods, and how exhausting the years of silent endurance had been.
The removal didn't erase the trauma, but it marked a clear beginning to something different, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to reestablish a household where safety was no longer negotiable. Mom's role in the new equilibrium became clearer as she faced her own responsibilities and choices. For the first time, she engaged actively in the healing process, not only for Danny and me, but for herself. She began attending counseling sessions, acknowledging her previous inability to act, and working to reconcile the guilt she carried with her desire to provide a nurturing, protective environment. Watching her make these changes was both comforting and complex. I could see her grappling with regret, but also actively striving to restore trust and stability. It reminded me that vindication wasn't just about removing a threat, it was also about empowering those who had been complicit through fear to reclaim their capacity to protect and support. Mom's gradual transformation reassured me that our family could emerge stronger from the chaos, that accountability and growth could coexist with love, and that courage often inspired courage. Danny, too, began to experience a subtle but profound transformation. Without the oppressive presence of Marco, he started to express himself more openly. He laughed more freely, explored small adventures in our neighborhood without constant anxiety, and even engaged in conversations about what had happened, asking questions I hadn't expected him to articulate. I guided him gently, explaining in age-appropriate terms how the truth had allowed us to seek protection, and how his courage in speaking up, even subtly, had contributed to the process. Watching him reclaim his sense of safety and childhood innocence was both heartbreaking and deeply gratifying. It reminded me that the consequences of speaking out were not abstract. They directly enabled the restoration of normalcy, autonomy, and dignity for both of us. Professionally, the support systems activated by the caseworker continued to play a critical role in stabilizing our lives. Regular check-ins ensured that we were not isolated in the aftermath of disclosure, that our safety remained a priority, and that the investigation into Marco's behavior was proceeding with the seriousness it warranted. Each meeting, each phone call, and each report filed reinforced the legitimacy of our experiences, providing a tangible framework in which the consequences of abuse were acknowledged and addressed. This sense of system-backed protection transformed the lingering fear into cautious confidence, a recognition that external oversight could indeed change the trajectory of lives once dominated by abuse. Socially, our dynamic began to shift as well. Mom, now more assertive and self-aware, reestablished routines and boundaries that Marco had previously undermined. I began to interact with peers more openly, sharing carefully curated aspects of my experience in safe spaces, and even found the courage to confide in a few trusted friends and teachers. The act of being seen, being heard, and being supported outside the home created a ripple effect of empowerment. It was not without challenges. Stigmas, awkward questions, and the residual tension from trauma remained. But each step forward reinforced the notion that life could be reclaimed, rebuilt, and lived with agency rather than fear.
Emotionally, the validation of our truth became the keystone of healing. I realized that the sense of vindication wasn't just about proving Marco wrong. It was about proving ourselves right, about acknowledging that our fears, our observations, and our courage had been legitimate all along. The external confirmation from professionals, combined with Mom's active participation, transformed what had once been shame, secrecy, and anxiety into resilience, empowerment, and hope. I understood that the new equilibrium wasn't just physical safety, it was emotional clarity, the ability to trust ourselves, to advocate for one another, and to exist without constant vigilance. By the end of those weeks, our home felt alive in a different way. Laughter returned, cautious but genuine. Danny's playful energy filled the rooms, Mom's calm guidance anchored the household, and I felt a sense of purpose in being a witness and advocate, not only for my own experience, but for those who might face similar situations in the future. The victory was subtle yet profound. The hidden truth had prevailed.
the consequences for wrongdoing had begun, and the path forward, though still fraught with challenges, was defined by transparency, protection, and agency. We had emerged from the darkness not unscathed, but empowered, ready to reclaim life and redefine what safety, love, and family could mean. Months had passed since Marco's removal, and life in our household had begun to take on a rhythm that once seemed impossible. The terror that had dominated every waking moment had slowly been replaced with a cautious sense of peace, though the scars, both emotional and physical, remained. I often reflected on how far we had come, the endless nights of anxiety, the bruises hidden beneath layers of clothing, the constant vigilance and the overwhelming fear of speaking out. Now, each morning felt like a reclamation, a small victory, and a testament to the power of truth, courage, and resilience. I had learned that the most profound transformations often came through enduring the darkest moments, facing fear head-on, and refusing to remain silent in the presence of injustice. Mom had become a steadfast ally in ways that I had never imagined possible. Her own journey toward understanding and accountability had reshaped our family dynamic entirely. She no longer flinched at confrontations, no longer minimized our experiences, and no longer hesitated to set firm boundaries. Counseling had helped her untangle the guilt and fear that had held her back for so long, allowing her to be present not only as a protector, but as a proactive advocate. Our relationship evolved as well. She was no longer just my mother, but a partner in navigating safety, healing, and rebuilding trust. I saw in her the courage that it had taken to acknowledge her mistakes, and it inspired me to continue standing firm in my own convictions, knowing that we were stronger together. Danny, too, had begun to reclaim pieces of his childhood that had been stolen by fear. Playfulness returned to his voice, curiosity brightened his eyes, and the subtle confidence he had started to develop during the investigations now flourished in small, everyday moments. I could see the relief in his posture, the ease in his interactions, and the unguarded laughter that had been rare during Marco's presence. Watching him thrive, witnessing the resilience of his spirit, reminded me that truth and protection were not abstract concepts. They had tangible, life-changing effects. Each day we spent together, free from intimidation, reinforced the reality that speaking out and demanding accountability was not just necessary, but transformative. Our home, once a place shadowed by fear and secrecy, became a space of renewal. Walls that had previously witnessed whispered threats and silent tears now resonated with conversation, laughter, and planning for the future. The rituals we established, shared meals without tension, open communication about feelings, and daily affirmations of safety reinforced our newfound equilibrium. Even the physical environment seemed to shift. Sunlight felt brighter, rooms felt less oppressive, and the simple act of moving freely without fear of retaliation was almost revolutionary. Each small change in our household symbolized progress, a tangible reflection of the internal transformations we had undergone. The legal and professional support continued to play a role, ensuring that the consequences for Marco were real and that our safety remained prioritized. Court dates, formal investigations, and ongoing check-ins created a structured framework in which justice could be maintained, but they also allowed us to transition from reactive survival to proactive living. The external systems that once felt distant and intimidating now became allies, providing protection, validation, and a path towards lasting stability. I realized that the combination of speaking truth, documenting experiences, and leveraging available support could reshape lives profoundly, and that the empowerment we felt was not solely internal, it was reinforced and safeguarded by external accountability. Emotionally, the transformation was even more profound. I began to shed the weight of guilt and self-blame that had shadowed my adolescence, recognizing that enduring abuse was never a fault of the victim. The fear that had once dictated every choice began to recede, replaced by a deliberate, conscious determination to live with agency and purpose. I reflected on the journey from silence to advocacy, from fear to courage, and from oppression to empowerment. Each step had required endurance, honesty, and relentless commitment, but the culmination was undeniable. Our voices had mattered, the truth had prevailed, and our lives were now guided by principles of safety, respect, and empowerment, rather than domination and fear.
I also discovered a sense of purpose in helping others who faced similar situations. The lessons I had learned, the importance of documenting evidence, of speaking courageously, of seeking professional guidance, became tools I could share with friends, mentors, and even online communities advocating for children's safety. I wanted Danny and I to be examples, living proof that speaking the truth could dismantle cycles of abuse and create paths toward healing. My role evolved from survivor to advocate, from victim to someone capable of guiding others through experiences that once seemed insurmountable. This sense of purpose added meaning to the trauma we had endured, turning pain into action, fear into empowerment, and secrecy into transparency. Finally, I recognized that our story, while painful, had transformed us in ways that extended beyond mere survival. We had reclaimed our lives, reshaped our family, and built a foundation of safety and honesty that would guide our futures. Every decision, every confrontation, and every courageous moment had led to this new life. A life in which fear no longer dictated behavior, in which truth was honored, and in which we could envision a future defined by hope, resilience, and agency. As I looked around our home, hearing Danny's laughter and Mom's calm guidance, I understood that transformation was complete. We were no longer defined by the shadow of abuse. We were defined by our courage, our persistence, and the unwavering belief in the power of truth to heal, protect, and inspire. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.